Welcome to the Bulletin Podcast.
Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Willy Brandt School Bulletin Podcast. My name is Manuel Mollenhauer. I'm a first-year student at the Willy Brandt School, and I'm happy to welcome our guest to the studio and introduce him. His name is Anton Berezutskii. He's a PhD candidate. I hope I pronounced the name right. He's a candidate from the Central European University in Vienna, and will talk to us today about the topic of Nord Stream and Germany's energy market. Hello, Anton. Would you like to introduce yourself and give us a little background about yourself and about your studies?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. My name is Anton Berezutskii. I'm indeed a PhD candidate at Central European University in Vienna, previously in Budapest, and currently I'm a visiting researcher at the Willy Brandt School, University of Erfurt. The Willy Brandt School is run by Andreas Goltau. He's one of the leading experts in the area which I study, so it was a no-brainer to me to apply to this particular school. I'm very happy and enjoying it full time.
All right. Then let's dive into the topic that we're talking about today. We have heard a lot in the last weeks about the coming winter again, about energy prices and so on. For those who may not be familiar with the topic, could you tell us what Nord Stream is and what its relevance to you and maybe particular Germany, which had for decades been the main importer of Russian gas on the continent, really is?
In general, physically it is, or it was, a pipeline, mainly offshore pipeline connecting Russia directly with Germany, passing through the marine zones of Russia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. Finally, more than 1,200 kilometers. The main investor, the runner of the project, was the Russian gas giant Gazprom, but also 5 other European companies were providing investments. And as I claim or hypothesize that they also provided some sort of lobbying efforts behind the project, and it became more than just a piece of gas infrastructure, because there are many pipelines, Nord Stream 1 for starters, and all other pipelines from Russia and from other countries. But this one attracted a lot of attention in terms of its potential geopolitical implications, political implications, and risks to many actors outside of this dyad of Russia and Germany, namely Ukraine, Poland. Okay, so take a step back and just tell you how I ended up with this topic in the first place. So basically, when I applied for this program at CEU, I had a little bit different of a project. My goal was to study the sanctioned individuals and companies, and how the counter-lobby mitigate the sanctions in the states that impose the sanctions. In my case was Russia versus Europe versus the EU member states. So then I started thinking of the sort of population of actors and area which I want to focus on. And energy is the most intensive area of cooperation between Russia and Europe. So Nord Stream was at that time probably one of the most hot and salad topics, and also very interesting in terms of its various dimensions. So that's why I ended up focusing on this ill-fated pipeline, and it was like around 2020, so it was still in construction. But obviously in recent years, it's the more critical and more important events happened that prevented it from construction. So and just the complexity of this policy issue required me to study at least to acknowledge myself with a lot of various literature on energy policy, on lobbying, on economy. It's both interesting but also challenging. I'm on a certain track with this problem, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex topic to be sure. You need to have a little bit of knowledge of kind of everything, how I understood it, what you just said. And we have seen that this is a topic where Germany and Russia have had maybe the biggest ties to each other. So we often talk about how Germany did it more from an economic standpoint, but the estimation was that this second pipeline would like double the amount which would go through the two Nord Stream pipelines, and the goal was to substitute coal with a more environmentally friendly gas, as it was put. Was that goal actually achievable? Did Germany have the infrastructure to do that? Do you know about it? And or did the Germans agree on the more gas delivering capacity also as a kind of strategically tranquilize Moscow and continue its Ostpolitics, its politics of growing closer together?
I think that's a very good and complex question, and I don't think there is like one answer to this. Both explanations were considered, I think. So in terms of like, in general, this pipeline was conceived in 2015. So one of the points of interest here, I think, is that it's been already a year since the Crimea annexation, which was like a major point of diplomatic conflict between Germany and Russia. And certain authors like Tein Gustafsson, I think he mentions that this decade, especially from 2015, was characterized by diverging policies. So on the one hand, we see that Germany was kind of main critics of Russian foreign policy, especially in Ukraine. However, the intensity of gas trade increased in these years, and obviously there were opponents and the critics and proponents of this project. In terms of those who argued in favor, they basically address certain dimensions. I will briefly name them. So probably the most obvious one is the direct purpose of this project is to bring gas and bring economic profit. So from this perspective, the argument was that first, the pipeline would be a source of additional and cheap gas based on long-term contracts, compared with, like, let's say, LNG or gas from elsewhere. The second is that, for example, the domestic production of gas in Europe was decreasing, especially in the Netherlands. Then subsidiary companies, they claim that the construction of the pipeline and future operation, because it doesn't end in Germany, then it's linked to a vast and complex network of gas pipelines, because Germany, it's not that Germany was supposed to take all the gas, it's also traded within other member states. So, the critic obviously said that, no, you cannot call this pipeline as a purely economic project, because we saw in the past that Russia used natural gas as an energy weapon. In particular, there were two major crises in Ukraine in 2006 and 2009. Especially in 2009, it was a very significant disruption right on New Year's Eve, and Germany was one of the countries that experienced the potential downside of it. Basically, what Gazprom told to their European clients, we can build, and in 2009 it was still about Nord Stream 1, we can build you the pipeline which will be bypassing this sensitive transit states like Ukraine, or there's another major pipeline network, Yamal pipeline, which goes for Poland, and if we will have this direct link, we promise you that you won't have any problems with the transit states.
Why were there problems by these states? Why were they kind of complicated transit states for Russia?
So very simply, with Ukraine, first of all, we need to distinguish, I think, the official narrative which is not a single one, because we have like the Russian narrative, and then we have Ukraine's narrative, and then also if we think of this problem from perspective of 2023, it's a different story. But basically, what Russia claimed very simply that Ukraine. I need to choose a word wisely. Picks a certain amount of gas, which is supposed to go directly to the final clients, to its own benefits, while Ukraine said that it's not true, is that Russia does not deliver the promised amount of gas per month or whatever. But also, speaking of some economic reasons, which was advocated by Nord Stream 2 consortium and also by those actors that supported it, is that first, the gas fields in Russia, certain gas fields in Russia were depleting as well, and there were new one, which Russia has plenty. And these pipelines, they serve the purpose of delivering gas from that new gas field serves better. And the second one is that the Ukraine has a very complex system of transmission network, and it's also pretty old. It's one of the oldest. The first pipelines were constructed in the 70s, if not earlier, and that the maintenance of this and certain repairments of this system requires investments, which, as Russia claimed, Ukraine just did not have or did not want to invest. So, yeah.
Okay, so multiple factors that just made it desirable for the Russians to circumvent the states. These states also have raised the alarm early on. Right now, the failure of the project has called into question Germany's and Europe's reliance on or over-reliance on Russian gas. The opponents questioned it against the EU cohesion, because you could take these as a political power to play out different players like the Eastern European countries against the Western, but also the endangerment of security and energy security. While, for example, Germany always also argued with the economic factors which have supported both countries, Russia versus trade and Germany with cheap gas to fuel their industry. How did it happen that these two coalitions were so... it was hard to see a common place with these coalitions, that one side wouldn't hear the other?
Thank you, very good question, and thank you for choosing the word coalitions. But I mean, it's more than that, because first of all, it's one of my objectives is to identify this coalition and count them. Secondly, as I mentioned, there are several dimensions, and for instance, I only mentioned economic and political dimension, but there's also this very, I call it actually like energy policy / energy security dimension. And finally, there's the environment dimension. Certain actors, they may conflict in terms of their outlook on one dimension, but they may find more in common in terms of other dimension. But let's say there are two coalitions. So I mean, the arguments of the opponents, they sort of like mirror the arguments of proponents of the project, and they emphasize this geopolitical risks of the pipeline. They also emphasize their vulnerability in terms of transit states. It's not only about revenues, like the case of Ukraine. It's also about the supply, and also, like, for instance, as I said, like gas is not Germany receives gas, but part of this gas traveled then elsewhere, and it's the case, for instance, nowadays as well. So yeah, it's about European solidarity in a general term, and that's what I think was according to my preliminary analysis, that was probably the most salient frame which was used and argued for with actors from Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic states in general, and then you need to consider the US, which also actively pushed this button of geopolitical implication, but for a slightly different reason. Also, the US has a sort of like a history of such problems of such kind, because they already, in the early 80s, there was an effort, like a major effort of the US to stop the fostering of the energy trade between the Soviet Union and Germany, based on the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, the war of Afghanistan, whatever we call it. So, yeah.
So different reasons from these actors, but also more of a focus on the geopolitical, as I hear. All right, so we have spoken about these, or we have kind of touched on the coalition building inside of Europe's discussion about these topics. You do something called the Advocacy Coalition Framework in your paper, which tells a little bit about how networks are built together. Can you just briefly explain what that is and how it is useful to talk about this topic?
Yes, thank you. I did use the Advocacy Coalition Framework, which is a very prominent policy analysis concept to approach this issue. And although there are certain debates in the academic literature to what extent it is a theory or just a framework, I think it gives a very good tool to look at a certain policy subsystem, which is the major unit of analysis in this framework. In my case, it's energy policy. Then the main idea behind this framework is that every policy subsystem, especially highly contested, which again energy policy is typically, especially nowadays, consists of competing coalitions of actors which are formed based on their shared beliefs and preferences. There are several layers of beliefs, starting from deep core beliefs and then policy core and instrumental beliefs. Let's say, for instance, the core belief would be like your ideology. Are you left-leaning or right-leaning, or maybe some cultural identity? It's not the case of my research because I don't go that deep. But what's interesting, the other two is the policy core belief. So, for instance, are you consider renewables as a way to go, or you think that the fossil fuels, fortunately or unfortunately, is the solution? And then there are policy instruments which are more specific. For instance, if you are a fossil fuel advocate, then you may prefer certain solutions in terms of like oil, gas, or maybe even more so like particular pipelines, which is exactly the case. So and then as soon as they figure out their preferences, they join like-minded actors, and the actors can be, it depends on the level of analysis, but ranging from, let's say, individuals, but then like political parties, governmental bodies, private companies, and I'm talking again specifically about the energy policy subsystem. And and then it's always easier to reach your goal when you're in a team with like-minded actors. So the question is though, okay, so this is the framework. How do I exactly identify these coalitions? Because I do address the academic debates, but since I want to go deep, I had to find my method, and I think I did. And the method is called discourse network analysis. It's the quite a new method, so to speak. It involves the study of mainly textual data, which consists of the statements made by actors on certain policy issues related to the policy subsystem of interest, which are publicly expressed and shared, so it makes it relational. And this the DNA analysis consists of qualitative and network parts. So qualitative parts typically consist of assembling the data, studying the data, figuring out which narratives were pushed and which arguments were used by the actors, because actors do speak publicly on the issues they are concerned of, because they want to mobilize their supporters, they want to signal to their potential supporters of their preferences. They also want to understand what would be the reaction of their opponents. So it's a pretty continuous process and relational process. And I'm studying the publications from the German newspapers across the whole period, starting from the year before the inception of the project up until the later months after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And then that allows me to construct networks based on actors and eventually coalitions based on their preferences in terms of various dimensions which we discussed of this issue, like political dimension, environmental, economy, etc., etc. So the network part is really interesting and also challenging, because it's pretty like it's an infinite process, and it involves a lot of knowledge if you want to really go deep, because it's like a separate network theory. But yeah, I'm slowly getting there.
All right. So interesting. So to summarize, you collect a lot of statements of different actors and try to show connections between each other. So by networks, you're also talking about all kinds of actors, not only politicians. You talk about companies, certain clubs, maybe policy clubs that push in a certain direction. How do you gather that information?
Yes, it's so very briefly it works like this. So actors usually they make a statement related to Nord Stream 2. That's why I'm searching when I'm doing this coding. And then they do not just mention the name Nord Stream 2. They say something substantial about it. For instance, like Nord Stream 2 should not be operational because it will bring risk to the energy security of Ukraine. That here I derive, again, informed by the academic literature, I identify a certain dimension, a concept related to the statement. In this case, it would be a concept, like a political concept. Because it's primarily about the European solidarity, in a way. And when you have it as a continuous process, you can see the changing nature of coalition, because it's a period of 8 years. And I personally identify the shapeshifters in terms of their position on the topic, and it's also about the change of the frame bundles which were used, and so I would recommend this method to everyone who studies this complex social phenomena. They cannot particularly identify like one decisive group of actors you're interested in, and this is exactly the case because political parties were prominent on the agenda, energy companies, especially those involved in the construction, and it's a very interesting method, I think.
So a method that it can also be used on other topics. And what I really like was also talking about shapeshifters that might be important to the process. If more people then go to another side, we see a difference in discourse. So yeah, very interesting topic. Is there like some surprises that you have seen, something where you think, oh, maybe that's something for future investigation or research, for a word of better use? That would be maybe interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the certain expectations were confirmed. Like, obviously, companies, like German companies, Wintershall or Uniper, they were all the way on board with the project, and they brought specific arguments into discussion, which typically relate to the specific area. So they mainly address the need of the additional and constant growing need of gas in the foreseeable future. And obviously the Russian government was all the way in favor. What was surprising, as I mentioned, the absence of the proxy Russian actors in the discourse. Then in terms of the events which attracted the most attention, I did not expect that in my data set, according to my data set, the main event in terms of like the frequency of statements made in this particular period was in relation to Nord Stream 2, was linked with the poisoning of the prominent Russian politician Alexei Navalny in 2020, and then he subsequently was treated in Germany, in Berlin. And around that period of time, various actors addressed the issue of Nord Stream 2 in context of this event. And so basically the main narrative of those who were against was that we cannot accept the completion of the pipeline when there is such a crackdown of the political freedoms in Russia, while more cautious proponents of the project, they try to highlight that we need to separate these two events. Another one is that it's probably the direction in which see the direction which I'm going with the political parties is that the topic which breached many actors who typically are different in terms of other aspects is that the active intrusion of the U.S. sanctions into this topic was met with a negative reaction from both German and German actors, meaning that the European energy policy and security, and German in particular, must be independent from the external intrusion. And actually, I think that mirrors the situation of the early 80s, although with it's different world. But still, that topic united typical rival clans or coalitions, if you want.
Yeah, very interesting that a non-energy event was one of the main factors that had an impact on this discussion. So thank you very much, Anton, for your expertise on that topic. Thank you for coming to the studio. I'll give you a chance for some words to our listeners, and then we say a little goodbye.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I managed to present the gist of what I'm studying. I'm pretty sure that this topic will still be prominent in the upcoming years, because I consider this pipeline like sort of a zombie. Even if it's dead, it still will return at some point, just in terms of its symbolic meaning, and as a sort of like maybe a lesson in terms of foreign policy and just in general grand strategy of Germany and Russia.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all the listeners. I'm encouraged to remind you to tune in into the next episode of the Willy Brandt School Bulletin Podcast. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.